All right. Okay, so today, I'm Malia Garcia. I'm an asset manager team lead within the Office of Housing, Finance, and Sustainability. I'm going to be presenting today with Jennifer DiGianardo and Teresa McCoy, and we're going to be covering the home final rule that was published by HUD this year. And just want to let you know that this is going to be a very high-level overview of the final rule, and we're not going to be going into the fine details of that. But we've just included a lot of information on this presentation today to let you know about those changes so that you're aware of those and just transparency in those. So our agenda today, we're just going to be talking about the background of the home final rule, the applicability, some of the summary of the changes that were made in there, the next steps with this, and any questions. So we suggest saving your questions for the end. We're going to open it up and have time for those. So if you have questions throughout the presentation, maybe write those down so you can save those for the end. All right, so what is home? If you're not familiar with it, but the Home Investment Partnerships Program is known for short as the HOME program. So the Department of Housing and Urban Development, HUD, administers grants to state and local governments to create affordable housing for low-income households through this HOME program. And the HOME program is one of the federal funding sources that DOH provides for developing affordable housing in Colorado. And now I'm going to pass it over to Jennifer to talk about the background.
Great, thank you, Malia. Good morning, everyone. So with the HOME program, this is the latest amendment to the home final rule. The latest or the most recent one was in 2013, so there's been quite a bit of time since then. HUD opened up comments from stakeholders and participating jurisdictions. The Division of Housing also provided comments to HUD to say these are the most challenging aspects of administering and using home funds, and this is how they could be better paired with other funding sources and programs. On January 6th of 2025, HUD published this new home final rule in the Federal Register. It originally took effect February 5th of 2025. However, they shifted that up to April 20th, 2025. There was some public comment. We don't anticipate there being more. There is a potential. So if there are any adjustments to what we present today, we'll be sure to communicate that out to our partners. Next slide, please. So for applicability, there are two categories with this home final rule. So the provisions that I have on this slide here are for projects with home funds committed before April 20th. And so those following provisions don't apply. So we'll dig into each of these provisions in a little more detail. But just to note that the remainder of the final rule that we touch on will be applicable to all projects on the effective date of April 20th. And again, just echoing that sentiment. So anything that we mentioned today, all of the home final rule will be applicable to projects with home funds committed on or after April 20th of this year. I'm going to pass it back over to Malia for her to touch on the summary of changes.
Thanks, Jennifer. So yeah, there are some changes when it comes to the rental housing with rent limits. So it's important to note that the tenant portion of the rent plus any utility allowance, if there are utilities charged to the tenants, those cannot exceed the home rent limit, regardless if there's any type of voucher, subsidy, or rental assistance. So the tenant portion plus utility allowance cannot exceed 30% of their monthly adjusted income or 10% of their monthly income in another program. And DOH will be verifying that the tenant portion does not exceed 30% of their income. And now there is a key difference in the final rule, which is that tenant-based vouchers are now allowed to exceed the home rent limit. So both project-based vouchers and tenant-based vouchers can exceed that home rent limit. This is a change from in previous years when the tenant-based voucher could not exceed the limit. So it's important to note those differences. And then going further with rent limits, if there is no sort of voucher or any sort of rental assistance or anything like that or subsidy, then the rent cannot exceed the rent limit. So just want to highlight on that, making sure you're checking all of our rent limits that we publish in the spring on our website. I've included a link here, and we will share out these slides so you have those links as well. But make sure you're paying attention to those effective dates on when the rent limits come out and implementing those correctly. So with utility allowances, the updated final rule now allows the Public Housing Authority or the PHA utility allowance schedule to be used. And so if you're planning to switch to the PHA schedule, the best practice would be to implement it at the beginning of the year and then applying it to those recertifications as they take effect. And they also highlighted that cable and broadband are not to be included in any utility allowances. All right, so with income determinations, their goal was to simplify and streamline the requirements. So they've changed some of the income determination methods. There are now these 3 acceptable methods of income determination, but just want to highlight that they're not limited to these. So the first change is that home units that are assisted by federal or state project-based rental subsidies may accept income statements made by other federal programs such as HUD-BASH, PBRA, Section 811, etc. And then home units also developed with the low-income housing tax credit may accept the income statements made for families in that program. And then finally, home units may accept the income statements made by another form of public assistance, such as federal, state, or local, like TANF, WIC, Medicaid, a public housing agency, or a local voucher made within the previous 12 months. So make sure you also look to your covenant, your use covenant for the other allowable methods of income determination. And we anticipate sending out a letter for partners to store with their use covenant to explain this change. And then just as a reminder that if your income requirements or flexibilities overlap, you should always use the most restrictive method. For example, if you're unable to get a statement from, say, CHFA, the Colorado Housing Finance Authority, or a voucher agency, then your next option would be to get third-party verification, such as verification of employment. And it's important to note that when we're talking about income determinations, we mean a statement or something on a letterhead from the administering agency that specifies the family size and total annual income. Those are 2 components that have to be included on that statement. So also just highlighting that these have to be made from the administrating agency, such as CHFA or Housing Authority, and that they cannot just be from the property management agency. So the intent is really just for getting some sort of source document statement from a third party. Also want to highlight that the 6-year source verification cycle is still applicable, and you're now able to use any of those methods that I mentioned on the previous slide. So any of those will also fulfill that requirement at initial eligibility determination and each year of the source document cycle verification years. So if you have any questions about those or have any questions about the 6-year source document cycle and would like a copy of your chart for your property, reach out to us.
All right. So next up with rental housing, an update that was made was a revision to the dollar threshold that defines the period of affordability for rehab or acquisition of existing housing. We don't see too many impacts on this one as the Division of Housing is already using the maximum subsidy. In addition, we tack on an additional period of affordability. So HUD has their period of affordability, Division of Housing tax on an additional period of time. And there was a revision to the definition of troubled home-assisted rental housing projects. And there is some relief that can be requested at this regulation. We're hoping that we continue strong, though, that we don't have to use that relief or have to indicate any of our projects as troubled. Similarly, HUD is allowing a maximum 10% per unit subsidy limit increase for the home funded projects. And with this, they must incorporate energy efficiency and resilient building standards, which include reduced energy costs and saving residents money. It is worth noting that we are waiting on guidance for energy efficiency and resiliency. So as we learn more about that, we'll provide that information to our partners.
All right, so with property standards, there were some updates. So I want to touch on that all housing units are required to have a carbon monoxide detector and a hardwired smoke detector on each level of the unit, in or near each sleeping area, in the basement, and in each common area of the project. And now for existing properties and projects, a smoke detector must be present on each level of the unit and within 21 feet of any door to a sleeping area or along the path of travel. It also now permits PJs to accept and Inspire inspections that are performed for other funders of the project instead of conducting our own final inspection upon rehabilitation completion or ongoing periodic inspections during the project's operation. And so DOH is coming up with a plan to implement Inspire inspections, and we will be providing further guidance in the near future. And going along with more property standards, the final rule did publish a table outlining just the minimum inspection sample size. Also, if a project involves both the rehabilitation and new construction of housing units, then DOH will have to apply the rehab standards to the units being rehabilitated and the new construction requirements or standards to those units that are being newly constructed. And then there was also some updates with the home tenant-based rental assistance, but DOH does not currently fund tenant-based rental assistance with home funds. So these updates do not apply. Again, we just wanted to highlight on some of these changes for transparency. All right, with tenant protections, there were some updated tenant protections that will only apply if home funds committed after the effective date. So that's important to note that these protections that I'm going to go through will only apply after the effective date to projects built after the effective date. So also want to note that for properties with home funds committed before the effective date, we recommend using the home and HTF lease addendum on DOH's website. And then there will be part of the final rule was a home like tenancy lease addendum, and this is going to be required for all home assisted tenants in those units after with funds committed after the effective date. And DOH is updating our lease addendums, and we're going to be sharing those out. They will also be posted to the website within the next month. And then on that home tenancy lease addendum, there are quite a few different provisions and restrictions and very specific things required in there. So we'll provide further information on that, and so that way your legal team will have time to review those and implement those. All right, so with the home tenancy lease addendum, there's going to be new protections for the physical condition of the unit. And the common areas, they basically outlining that these need to be kept in decent, safe, and sanitary condition. You must provide tenants with written expected timeframes for repairs. Also, any notice of entry needs to be with specific dates and times and purpose. Also, any action taken against the tenant must be in writing and accommodate an individual with a disability or language needs. For the security deposits, they cannot exceed 2 months rent. And then you cannot terminate the tenancy or refuse to release except for serious violations of the lease or other good cause. There's also updated protections with providing 30 days notice for the sale of a property. There must be 5 days notice, business days if there's a change in ownership or property management. So those are just some of the protections that are going to be included in that home tenancy lease addendum.
Shifting gears to home buyer housing, I want to start by saying that we have not executed home buyer agreements with Home, so we don't see too much of an impact to our partners, but want to have some transparency on these updates. So just to highlight, this new rule allows home buyer housing acquired with home assistance up to 6 months to meet property standards. These are specific to 92.251. It extends the deadline for the sale of home buyer housing from 9 months to 12 months following the completion of construction. And it established 4 model resale formulas to assist PJs, participating jurisdictions, complying with home resale requirements. And so those formulas are a fixed rate, itemized, appraisal, and index models. We are going to take some questions at the slide if you wouldn't mind holding off on that. We can unmute then. Let's see. Continuing on, it modifies the provision to require the period of affordability to begin after execution of the enforcement instrument that recaptures the home investment or recordation of resale restrictions against that property. It revises the dollar threshold that defines the period of affordability, revises and clarifies lease purchase program provisions. It updates the definition of community land trusts. And really the intent with that is to recognize that the purpose of community land trusts are for participation in the home program serving low-income households. It allows qualified community land trusts to exercise preemptive rights in the event of a resale of a home-funded community living or land trust unit. I'm sorry about that. Next slide. And lastly, during the period of affordability, an owner can sell or otherwise convey a home-assisted rental unit to an existing tenant.
So there's also some changes to community housing development organizations. As you may know, a portion of our home funds goes to these CHODOs. And there's some slight changes in how a CHODO is defined as a qualified CHODO. So I'm thinking of these in basically 2 different buckets. The first is there's changes in the board composition requirements. So there's always been a requirement that 1/3 of the board represent the low-income community, but the definition of what qualifies as representing that a low-income community has been broadened to clarify that low-income beneficiaries of home programs are included, and also designees of nonprofits that serve low-income individuals. And you can see some examples of what might be considered a nonprofit that serves low-income individuals, homeless providers, fair housing initiatives programs, etc. You can read it, that comes straight from the reg. Additionally, so hopefully that will make meeting those low-income board representation requirements a little bit easier. Additionally, there has always been a cap on types of public officials on a CHODO board. This clarification clarifies that only public officials that are officials or employees of the government that established the CHODO count towards that 1/3 cap. So since we're not even seeing very many CHODOs that are created by a government entity in the first place, this is basically becoming a non-issue for us. Yeah, only if your CHODO is created by a government entity does this apply. And the second main category is capacity requirements for CHODOs. So previously, a CHODO needed to demonstrate housing development experience and capacity to take on a CHODO project using only paid volunteers. This new home final rule allows a CHODO to also include the capacity of any volunteers or any board members when they're looking at their capacity. So if your paid volunteers have experience in rental housing, but the CHODO really wants to do a home ownership housing, maybe they can find a volunteer or a board member to help support them in that additional capacity. Also, the CHODO may share development responsibility with another entity. That could be another CHODO or a non-CHODO to build that capacity, as long as one CHODO retains the decision-making authority and retains that, becomes that point person, point CHODO for the project. And this is just basically a clarification. As has always been the case, the CHODO, when they're developing a project, has to operate as either owner, developer, or sponsor. And those definitions of what each of those include are included in the regs. And this basically is just saying that in our written agreement for a CHODO project, we'll specify that in the written agreement. And the second bullet point clarifies that the CHODO has to comply with those regulations, depending on whether they're an owner, developer, or sponsor.
All right, so now I'm going to be talking about the next steps. So DOH is going to be publishing an official memo on our website. We'll be sending that out. And we're also going to be publishing that home tenancy lease addendum that I touched on. This memo, it just summarizes a lot of the information that we have in this presentation and our interpretation from the final rule. We will, if there's any changes or updates to that, we will publish a second memo in the future as well. And like we also mentioned, the DOH intends to issue a letter of clarification for changes to your use covenants or regulatory agreements that you can keep with those. So look out for those in the near future. And then just update your policies to reflect these changes and reach out to your asset manager for any questions or clarification you have on these. So I wanted to include our contact information as well. If you have any questions, if your project or property is in its period of affordability, you can reach out to me. If you have questions with projects that are being developed, reach out to Teresa McCoy. And again, we will be sending out these slides, so you'll have that information. And then I also included just some documents and resources in here. So if you want to read through the final rule and other fact sheets and stuff like that, you can access those through these links. All right, now we can open it up to questions.
I'll take this first question. This is from Lola. Does this new rule apply to HDF, CHIF, NSP? And so for those that don't know, those are other funding sources at the state, and then NSP is federal. Right now, we're only speaking to the home program. So we will provide further clarification on how that's going to impact those other funding sources and programs in the near future. You're welcome. Okay, so Jessica has a question. With the allowance of exceeding the home rent limits for units with housing choice vouchers, can owners do this now, or do we need to wait until lease renewal? I'm thinking of a local state statute that says you can only do a rent increase once per year. So I would recommend waiting until lease renewal to make sure that that's done once in a 12-month period.
Good question. Feel free to come off mute if you would like to just ask your question aloud. Right, and if you don't want to answer your question in front of the larger group or on camera, on the recording, a few of us will hang around till after we stop the recording at the very end if you would like to ask it in a smaller setting. We did get a question. Can you review PB versus non-PB rents again? Oh, okay. So with the rents, so project-based vouchers, if there's a tenant that has a project-based voucher, it can exceed the rent limit. And now if there's a tenant-based voucher, the change is that also can exceed the rent limit. So those are just like the two main things to highlight with those. Anything else to that, Jennifer?
No, I think you covered that well.
Okay.
We have another question from Jessica. For current home unit households, do we need to have them sign the home tenancy lease addendum or wait until lease renewal or new lease ups? Malia, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, so this one, it is a little confusing. So the home tenancy lease addendum is only going to be required for any properties or projects committed on or after April 20th. So that will be its own lease addendum that they will have to sign for any new properties being developed and everything after that effective date. Those will need to be signed at initial move-in and at every recertification. And so for existing properties, anything committed before April 20th, we just recommend as a best practice having them sign a home or HTF lease addendum, and we have a template of that on our website. So you don't need to worry about that home tenancy lease addendum if your property's been developed and funds committed before April 20th. And then we did get a question too. So for income determination for initial occupancy, is the 2 months of income source no longer required? So with this, you can still gather 2 months of income with source documentation. That is still an allowable income determination method. We were just saying that the final rule highlights that you can now use these other methods that we touched on by gathering those statements from another federal, state, or local agency that's administering those types of public assistance. So that's the main changes, that those are now allowed for income determination, but feel free to still gather source documentation if that's your practice.
Appreciate that good question. That was a good question. Thank you.
All right. Not seeing any other questions. We'll give it a sec, but just want to thank everyone for attending today. And as we mentioned, this will be posted on our website as well as the slides, so you'll have access to those. And feel free to follow up with any other questions you may have. Reach out to us. We know this can be a lot of information and questions may come up, so we are happy to help in any way we can. And just want to thank you all for your time today. Have a great rest of your day.
Thanks all.